Βρισκόμαστε εδώ στον όμορφο χώρο των Πανεπιστημιακών Εκδόσεων Κρήτης για να συνομιλήσουμε με τον Eduardo Cadava, το βιβλίο του οποίου «Χαρτιά, κοιμητήρια» κυκλοφόρησε αυτές τις μέρες από τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης. Πριν ξεκινήσουμε τη συνομιλία μας με τον Eduardo, αυτόν τον τόσο σημαντικό Αμερικάνο στοχαστή και φιλόσοφο, θα ήθελα να σας διαβάσω δύο λόγια για το βιογραφικό του. Ο Eduardo Cadava είναι καθηγητής αμερικανικής λογοτεχνίας και κάτοχος της έδρας Philip Mayhew στο Πανεπιστήμιο Princeton. Συνεργάζεται επίσης με το Τμήμα Συγκριτικής Λογοτεχνίας, την Αρχιτεκτονική Σχολή, το Κέντρο Ελληνικών Σπουδών Σίγκερ και το Ινστιτούτο Διεθνών και Περιφερειακών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου. Ειδικεύεται στην Αμερικανική Λογοτεχνία και Κουλτούρα, τη θεωρία και ιστορία της φωτογραφίας, τη συγκριτική λογοτεχνία, την πολιτική θεωρία και φιλοσοφία, τις τεχνολογίες των μέσων ενημέρωσης, τη θεωρία της μετάφρασης. Έχει γράψει εκτενώς επίσης για την αρχιτεκτονική, τη μουσική, τη δημοκρατία, τον πόλεμο, τη μνήμη και τη λύθη, τις φιλετικές διακρίσεις και τη δουλεία, τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα και την ηθαγένεια. Έχουμε λοιπόν τη χαρά και την τιμή να συνομιλούμε απόψε με τον Eduardo Cadava, τον οποίο θέλω να καλησπερίσω και να τον ευχαριστήσω πολύ που βρίσκεται μαζί μας. Welcome, Eduardo. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Τα «Χαρτιά, κοιμητήρια» είναι ένα συγκλονιστικό βιβλίο υψηλής αισθητικής. Πρόκειται για μια συλλογή δοκιμίων που μιλούν για εικόνες, φωτογραφικές αλλά και κάποιες ζωγραφικές και διερευνούν με τον πιο διεισδυτικό και λεπτέστητο τρόπο τη σχέση τους με τη μνήμη, ατομική και συλλογική, εκούσια και ακούσια, και την ιστορία με τις πολλαπλές της χρονικότητες. Ο τίτλος του, «Χαρτιά, κοιμητήρια», είναι μια φράση που ταξιδεύει στο χρόνο από το μακρινό 17ο αιώνα μέχρι σήμερα, όπως μας εξηγείς, Εντουάρντο, στην εισαγωγή σου, αποκαλύπτοντάς μας με την αλληγορική της δύναμη πως κάθε κείμενο και κάθε εικόνα είναι ένα έργο πένθους. Όμως δεν είναι αλήθεια πως το ίδιο το ταξίδι της φράσης στο χρόνο και οι μετασχηματισμοί της μεταφέρουν και ένα διαρκές αίτημα ζωής? Μπορείς να μας πεις περισσότερα γι' αυτό? Γιατί την επέλεξες ως τίτλο αυτή τη φράση και πώς συνδέεται ακριβώς με ό,τι προσφυώς ονομάζεις τέχνη της ανάγνωσης των εικόνων ιστορικά και πολιτικά?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for being here. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. I also want to thank Kriti University Press and Panayiotis Sultanis and Eleni Christia for making all of this possible. And also the fact that they're making it possible for this book to have an afterlife. And especially in Greek, because Greece has become my adopted home in some way. So it's very meaningful for me that the book is now going to be in Greek. I think that the fact that there is a translation, that there is this afterlife, already touches on the question you're asking, because you're talking about something that has happened and then continues to happen. So the fact that the book is published and then published in another language, has an afterlife, is linked to this relationship between the past and the present, or the past, the present, and the future, that is at the heart of many of the reflections in the book. This has to do with what you're saying, the circulation of this title through the book, but also from where I got it, right? The passage, the phrase, paper graveyards, is a phrase that I found in Benjamin's Trauspiel book, his book on the German mourning play. He's citing, as he always does, he's citing Johann Hallmann, who in the 17th century writes a book called Funeral Orations. And in that book, Hallmann apologizes in the midst of plagues, wars, and the consequences of plagues and wars on the world. During this moment of plagues and wars, he says that the paradises become hells, roses become thorns. There's this universal stage of death all around him. And in this context, he asks forgiveness for opening up his paper graveyard, which is his book. And so I love this title. And in fact, after choosing it for the book, and after writing much of it, I remembered a detail, which is that one of my earlier books, a book on Benjamin and photography, actually closes in its last section with a citation of this passage. So there's a way where without knowing it, I was citing something, recalling something that I had already been aware of. But recalling it, I mean, over 20 years later, right? And I think this citationality and the way in which these passages can circulate in time, as you're saying, suggests that every text, every photograph, every artwork not only has a relationship between the past and the present, but it survives, it continues. So one can say that every artwork, every photograph always has to do with both death and survival, right? The way in which photographs and artworks have a relation to death is very easy. When you have a photograph in your hand, it's the best evidence that what you have in your hand is not what was photographed. So the photograph exists in relation to the absence of what was photographed. So the photograph always has a relation to the experience of mourning and death. But of course, the photograph is also about preserving, conserving, and having a memory survive. So every photograph is about both death and survival. I chose the title because it was in my head. I often think that my books are smarter than I am. My writing is smarter than I am. It knows before I do what is happening to me. So before I registered that I was citing already a citation from an earlier book of mine, I was already doing this. I chose it, though, because that passage, which has to do with references to wars, to plagues, to death, and so on, was very resonant to me during the pandemic. Right? So I wrote this book. I finalized it, even though I should say this. The book is composed of a series of essays that I had written earlier, but I return to these essays and I expand them. So the book, as it's published, over 60% was entirely new. Over 300 pages were entirely new. So it was this going back in order to go forward, which is Benjamin's preferred mode of addressing the present. He always goes backwards in order to talk about the present. But I chose this title then because it's linked to this passage, wars, plagues, etc. And I'm finalizing the writing and the production of the book during the pandemic. At a certain point, I should say, I had resisted. You will soon discover that when I start talking, I threaten to go on forever like a river. But when I was writing this, I had been asked numerous times to write about the pandemic. And I had resisted, I had refused to write about the pandemic. I didn't think I had a language to match the speed and scale of its globalization. But when I was finishing the book, I didn't feel I could publish a book called Paper Graveyards without talking about the pandemic. So I wrote an afterword called Lessons of the Hour, which draws its title from the last speech that the American writer Frederick Douglass, the African-American writer Frederick Douglass, gives in his lifetime on lynching. And I'm writing the afterword in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection against the Capitol in the US, where the figure of lynching comes up. So I did write this postscript, this epilogue, and use a series of photographs during the span of 20 years to talk about different kinds of pandemics. So the title is chosen partly because of the moment, the circumstances. I chose the title also because it has its source in a citation from Benjamin. It was a way of me marking my long engagement with Benjamin. I liked having a reference to Benjamin in the title. And then finally, I chose it also because for a long time, paper has been the material support for photography. So there was a way in which I could reference photography, since the book has so much to do with photography, in the title as well. A graveyard is a site that bears the traces of an entire network of historical relations. And so part of the book, and I can talk about this later too, is about how to read photographs historically, how to excavate all the history that is sealed in the surface of a photograph. So these are the reasons why I chose the title.
Εντουάρντο, η συλλογή περιλαμβάνει 6 δοκίμια. Η φωτογραφούπολη του Ναντάρ, που εστιάζει στα απομνημονεύματα του Γάλλου πρωτοπόρου φωτογράφου του 19ου αιώνα, είναι το πρώτο δοκίμιο του τόμου. Η ερειπωμένη εικόνα, που εκκινεί από τη διάσημη εικόνα της βομβαρδισμένης βιβλιοθήκης στο Λονδίνο του 1940, οι σημειώσεις για τον έρωτα και τη φωτογραφία που έγραψες μαζί με την Παόλα Κορτές Ρόκα και στο οποίο πραγματεύεστε κριτικά τα πιο διάσημα αξιώματα του επιδραστικού για τη φωτογραφική εμπειρία κειμένου του Ρολάν Μπάρτ «Φωτεινός θάλαμος». Και μετά, τέταρτο δοκίμιο είναι το σχεδιάζοντας σε γλώσσες, ένα δοκίμιο για το ύστερο ζωγραφικό έργο του Αμερικανού εικαστικού Λίον Γκόλουμπ και τη συνάφεια στη συντρόφου του Νάνσι Σπέρο, επίσης εικαστικού με αυτό, το «Δέντρα, χέρια, άστρα και πέπλα» που διαβάζει τα φωτογραφικά πορτρέτα του Φάζαλ Σέικ και το «Μαθαίνοντας να βλέπω», μια στοχαστική και διεισδυτική ματιά στο φωτογραφικό έργο της Σούζαν Μεϊζέλας. Ποιο είναι το κοινό νήμα που συνδέει τις αφηγήσεις αυτών των 6 δοκιμίων και πώς εξηγεί τη σημασία της συνύπαρξής τους σε αυτόν τον τόμο?
Basically, the collection brings together 6 essays and the afterword that were written during the span of 20 years. And as I said just a minute ago, I went back to these things and then expanded them, developed them, etc. So there was a way in which I was going back to these texts that had been written during the course of 20 years, but looking at them, rethinking them from the moment in which I was in, right? And so when I did that, of course, because I'm one person, okay, many people in one, but there is a thread, and the thread is me in some way. And the thread has to do with, let's say, the persistence of my interest in trying to think about how to read images historically. And in the long run, how to read images historically, especially in moments of danger. So the texts are organized in my mind in 2 clusters of 3. They're organized chronologically in relation to the materials that are being discussed, so that the first text is the Nadar, because Nadar is writing right around 1900, taking photographs in the 19th century. It moves to the image of the bombed out library in London after a blitz, which is in the 1940, and then goes to the Bart, and then goes, and then it goes, the Golub, the Fazl. These are chronological in relation to when the materials were produced. The exception in that chronology is the letter to Susan Meiselas. And this was just because it's a different genre, and because it was a different genre, I put it at the end. There are other things I can say about that, but maybe we can discuss that later. So these are 6 essays written during the course of 20 years, but organized chronologically in relation to the chronology of the materials being discussed. The first 3 essays, I would say, are, let's say, theoretical discourses, trying to generate not just a discourse on photography, but a kind of lexicon for the discourse of photography. So the essay on Nadar is on the memoirs of Nadar and the way in which he has recourse to the language of photography when he talks about memory, perception, etc. I found it very interesting that it's a book where he's trying to talk about his role in the history of photography. He writes about the history of photography and doesn't include a single photograph in the book. So this was interesting to me, how he wants to tell the history of photography without photographs. So this is one of the ways in which I go after the question of photography. Photography, for me, is a technology, but photography is also a lever, a rhetorical lever that I can use to open up a whole series of philosophical questions. This gets followed up by the reading of the bombed out library, the reading of the Bart, Camera Lucida. And then there's a kind of turn for me in the middle of the book. And the next 3 essays are more politically marked. And so in some way, what I'm doing in the first three essays is setting the stage for the kinds of questions that will then allow us to think about how these questions get mobilized within a political context. I think that what the essays do in a moment during these 20 years where there was an explosion of images, an explosion of discussions about the role and place of images in our everyday life, medical imaging, surveillance, warheads with cameras, so that there's a proliferation of images with cell phones and everything. Moholy-Nagy in 1927 already says that the illiteracy of the future will be not of reading and writing, but of photography. So in some way, the book is meant to be a training manual on how to read images in order to combat a kind of illiteracy in relation to images. Same year, Sigrid Kakauer has an essay called Photography. In there at one point he says, we have never known so much, we've never lived in a time that has known so much about itself, if knowing about itself means having an image of everything. And then he talks about the proliferation of images, the flood of images, the blizzard of images. And then he starts talking about how there's so many images that we're living in relation to that we don't have time to think about the history sealed within them. So that by the time he gets to the end of the paragraph, he says, we have never lived in a world that has known so little about itself. And I think this is an amazing essay about the information age, about now. And so the book, what brings the essays together is that each one develops a series of readings that try and not only establish, but also expand the way in which we talk about photography. And it begins in the presupposition that maybe what we don't know is what photography is. If you read the book, you'll see that different things become photographic. I can talk about trees. I can talk about the way in which the sun goes through the leaves of the tree, produces images on the ground, so the tree becomes a kind of photographic medium or photographic apparatus. And so I do this with stars, with corpses, so that if trees, stars, and corpses can have photographic dimensions, then maybe we don't yet know what a photograph is. So the book is that what brings the essays together is a slow, meditative reflection on the nature of images, the role and place of images in our everyday life, and within the political domain also. So I think that there is a kind of coherence. The book moves cumulatively. There's a logic to the order, so that in one sense you read one, and you kind of have to read the one to go to the next one, read those two to go to the next one, and so on. So that by the time you get to the end, where I'm talking about, among other things, the pandemic, bringing it up to the present, there's a way in which by the time you get to the end, you've undergone this process, at least seeing how someone goes about reading images historically.
Γνωρίζω ότι μετέφρασες από τα γαλλικά στα αγγλικά το αυτοβιογραφικό κείμενο του Λαντάρ όταν ήμουν φωτογράφος και μέσα από αυτή τη μεταφραστική διαδικασία προέκυψε μια πολύ σημαντική απόφανσή σου. Μετά την έλευση της φωτογραφίας, γράφεις, η ίδια η γλώσσα αποκαλύπτει το φωτογραφικό χαρακτήρα της. Μπορείς να μας μιλήσεις λίγο παραπάνω για αυτή την πυκνή φράση σου?
This is linked partly to what I said a little while ago, that what struck me in reading Nadar's memoirs, I mean, not too many people read Nadar's memoirs. And when they read the memoirs, they usually read it as Nadar trying to self-aggrandize himself within the history of photography. Rosalind Krauss, the art critic, at one point says about the memoirs that what you really have in the memoirs is someone relegating the history of photography to the local town gossip, because the book is told in little vignettes, anecdotes, and so on. There's a very loose way in which the memoirs unfold. But what I registered when I was reading it is that each one of the sections, there are 14 vignettes that compose the memoirs, each one of the sections is in miniature an allegory of some feature of photography. So that in some way he's staging, he's performing what he wants you to understand. And if he doesn't produce images, if he doesn't give you photographs, it's because the language itself is photographic, right? This is what I'm trying to suggest. So part of what I'm interested in these essays is thinking about our recourse to the language of photography when we talk about memory, when we talk about perception. For example, I teach a course on literature and photography. And this course is another way of thinking about the relationship between language and its photographic character. And this is a course on the way in which literature and philosophy have recourse to the language of photography when they talk about the relationship between memory and forgetting, subjectivity and objects, life and death, mournfulness and survival, presence and absence, light and darkness, all these things that are philosophical motifs. For example, Marcel Proust, at one point he talks about entering a room, seeing his grandmother, registering that she's aging. And he registers that she's aging because he has an image in his head of what she used to look like. And then he says, what happened in my mind was indeed a photograph. So I'm very interested in these moments when writers and philosophers use the language of photography to talk about memory and perception. Freud does it. He often has recourse to the technical media in order to discuss the transition between the unconscious and the conscious. Bergson talks about images, the photographic character of images in the body. The body is an archive of images, so that you can track this history. So what interests me is thinking about the relationship between language and images. And this is one way in which I can do it. There would be lots of ways to do it. You could look at literature that incorporates photographs in it. Sebald in Austerlitz, Benjamin in the Berlin Childhood, all these texts that incorporate images would be one way to think about the relationship between language and photography. You also have photographers who sometimes stage literary scenes. So Julia Cameron goes back to Tennyson's Idylls of the King and has people dress up like characters and then photographs the characters. Jeff Wall takes The Invisible Man and invents a photograph of the invisible man. So this would also be another way. And then the other way is the one that I said, the way in which these writers use the language of development, images, light and darkness, etc., in order to talk about philosophical ideas. So this is what I said before. I'm interested in photography as a technology, but also interested in photography as a lever to open up a whole series of philosophical questions about what it means to remember, what it means to see, what it means to read historically. So what I'm doing there is linked to this thing where the advent of photography allows us to think about this photographic character. The only little addendum I will say is that what also interests me is the way in which we didn't have to wait for the invention of photography to understand what photography could tell us about memory and forgetting, about seeing and remembering. So we could go back to Medusa. We could go back to Echo and Narcissus and find resources for thinking photographically. This is why I think Derrida in his book Athens Still Remains, the book on the photographs of Jean-François Bonhomme, goes back to the Greeks and in fact says that the word photography may be the most Greek word because it's light and writing, etc. And he goes back to the Greeks, and it's a kind of interesting thing. He goes to Greece, he comes to Greece. It's not surprising that when he's in Greece, he thinks of Greek philosophy. What's more surprising is that he uses ancient Greek philosophy to talk about this modern technology, which is photography. So again, I'm interested in the technology, but also photography as a resource, as a language, as a discourse to think about other things.
Η ερειπωμένη εικόνα μου έφερε εμένα στο νου τη μελαγχολία του Μαγκρίτ και ταυτόχρονα οι μορφές που αναζητούν βιβλία μέσα στα ερείπια με γεμίζουν αισιοδοξία. Ποια θα έλεγες τελικά πως είναι η σχέση της φωτογραφίας με το ερείπιο, τον έρωτα και το θάνατο?
It's basically, can you tell me everything that you think about always? okay, ruins, love, and death. All the essays, each one in its own way, is about ruins, love, and death. I mean, I think also one can always only love ruins because one can always only love what's mortal. So I think that the Nadar, in the Nadar essay, he's looking at the catacombs, he's looking at the transformation of Paris, he's looking at, in that transformation of Paris, the destruction of buildings in order to Haussmannize the city. So he's looking at the destruction of the city, he's looking at corpses, death, and so on, and he's linking this to this city, which he calls a photographopolis, a city full of photographs. So it's a text that is very much about the relation to ruins. The essay on the bombed out Holland House Library, of the people looking at these walls with the wreckage behind them. The Bart, the Susan Meiselas with the corpses and ruins, the Fasel. So ruins are a figure throughout the book, and I think it has to do with linked to love, what I said very telegraphically, that we can always only love ruins. We can always only love what's mortal. And again, the text that brings all this together, I mean, all of the essays do it, but let's say the text par excellence that brings together ruins, love, and death is Barthes' Camera Lucida, right? One of the most canonical, gorgeous meditations on photography. And it's a book that, you probably know, he writes it after the death of his mother. So some people have read it as an elegy to his mother that just so happens to talk about photography. Other people read it as a meditation on photography that just so happens to talk about the death of his mother. I think you have to read these two things together precisely because within the history of photographic discourse, mothers have always been another name for photography. Because like the camera, mothers are mechanisms of reproduction. There are lots of grandmothers, I've already referred to one, lots of grandmothers in the history of the discourse on photography, but grandmothers are just mothers squared. So there's so if you track the Barthes text though, he says that every photograph speaks of death. And this is one of the things I was saying, that because the photograph bears a relation to the absence of what was photographed, one of the experiences par excellence of the photograph is the experience of mourning, right? Every photograph exists in relation to the absence of what was photographed. So this connection between ruins, death, and love, because you can always only love what's mortal, is something that circulates through the whole thing. And in fact, at one point in the letter that I write to Susan Meiselas, which closes, with the exception of the postscript, which closes the sequence, I talk about her passion and love for photography and identify it with her obsession with ruins and corpses. But there's something about the let's say the passion she has in documenting ruins and corpses that has everything to do with an allegory of photography. Right? These things are totally linked. I could say more, but maybe this is a very telegraphic way of saying that each one of the essays, in its own way, thinks about that connection, and that you could think of photography as a means of talking about ruins, as a means of talking about love, as a means of talking about death, but it does all of it, always.
Εντουάρντο, ίσως να ξαφνιάσει τον αναγνώστη σου η επιλογή να συμπεριλάβεις το ύστερο ζωγραφικό έργο του Λίον Γκόλουμπ σε αυτή τη συλλογή. Γι' αυτό θα ήθελα να μας πεις μέσα από ποια συγκεκριμένη διαδρομή ενεργοποιεί το διάλογο μεταξύ ζωγραφικής και φωτογραφικής εικόνας αυτό το έργο που επέλεξες.
He is an unusual choice in the book because he's a painter and everyone else I write about is a photographer. But maybe it helps for me to explain how I came to write about him. I was invited by the Drawing Center in New York to write on his late paintings. Golub is mostly known for these very enormous canvases that talk about war, interrogations, torture, Vietnam, all sorts of political issues related to American empire, racism, etc. And when he got older, though, he couldn't work on these big canvases, which used to require him getting on ladders and everything. So toward the end of his life, he starts making these little 8 by 10 drawings, paintings. And I was invited by the Drawing Center to write about these little paintings. I was looking at them, and I spent some weeks looking, and I didn't like them. So I was on the verge of pulling out, of calling the Drawing Center and saying, unfortunately, I don't really have much to say about them. When Nancy Spero, his longtime partner, died. When she died, they went into the studio and they discovered all the photographs on the basis of which he'd made the little drawings. So then it became totally interesting to me, that these are photographically based drawings and paintings, right? So I did this little 18-page text for the Drawing Center. Then when I'm doing paper graveyards, I return to the little text, and all of a sudden I register a particular late drawing, which is called The Hierophant. And it's a picture of a naked woman with her body like this, in red, with a kind of cloud or wisp of cloud behind her, like this. And I'm looking at this little painting, and I think, it looks like Nancy. The face looks like Nancy. And so all of a sudden, this becomes totally interesting to me, because late in his life, he does this little painting called The Hierophant. Hierophants are mostly male, but in this instance, it's a female. And it's Nancy. So this became very beautiful for me. It's almost at the end of his life, he does this little portrait of Nancy, and she's his Hierophant. She's the person who introduces him to the mysteries of life and death and so on. And so I found it very beautiful, but I'm doing this reading of this image then, and all of a sudden I realize this is his angel of history. And in fact, the Benjamin description of Clay's angel, Angelus Novus, everybody says it doesn't match the Clay picture. But if you overlay his description of the angel of history on this picture of Nancy as the Hierophant, it's perfect, because you've got her looking at this, you've got the gust, the storm of the wind and so on, looking at her back is to the future, etc. Anyway, there's a way of reading her as the angel of history. Then I look at the clay, which I've looked at hundreds of times in my life. And I realize that the clay angel is a lion. You've got the things that are usually read as Torah scrolls is the mane of a lion, and the nostrils are a lion. Leon is a lion, right? The lion is Leon. The bird, remember the image, they're bird feet on this monstrous little hybrid character. In Lithuanian, and Golub has that ancestry, Golub means pigeon. So you've got the lion and the pigeon, and so he inscribes himself in this angel, and then you've got the two of them. So I realized that if I'm going to write on this Golub, expand it, I have to turn to Nancy. So I end up turning to Nancy. I find a photograph that I think is the source, the Hierophant, and so I do a reading of it. Now, this does produce a dialogue between painting and photography, because his paintings are based on a photograph. And so if you think about it, there are lots of painters who rely on photographs. I mean, from Warhol to Rauschenberg to Francis Bacon, Gerhard Richter. They all use photographs as a basis for some of their paintings. So, and Richter goes quite far that he's not trying to produce necessarily photographs, but they are kind of photographs. He's trying to produce something different. And so it allowed me to think about the photograph in relation to other mediums, which I do also earlier in the book. But to think of photography as something that was never a single thing. One of the things that makes photography, it was never a single thing, from heliotrope, calotype, nipsotype, all the analog forms, and then the digital forms. So it was also a way to produce, as you're suggesting, not just a dialogue between painting and photography, but also a dialogue between photography and other mediums. And so a lot of it is generated out of that, the reading of that one, let's say one painting. But what I do there, as I do in other readings, is I show how many worlds are sealed inside that painting, right? And they knew the Benjamin. I had access to the entire library that they had. And they had the Benjamin, but they also had a Carolyn Forche book called The Angel of History. So there's a way of showing, again, the multiple worlds within an artwork. And also the other thing that I liked about working on that piece was not just the dialogue between painting and photography, but also the collaboration between Spero and Golub. They lived together, they worked together, and there was a way in which it said something about how all work is always collaborative, right? There's no work that is not collaborative. So I don't know if that answers, but I think that it was a way, it was my interest in the end in Golub was his use of photographs. I mean, he, from the very beginning, if he was interested in thinking about the body, he was collecting photographs from Sports Illustrated. He was thinking about war. He was looking at images from Soldier magazine, Soldier of Fortune magazine. He also, when he was interested in animals and movement, he was looking at National Geographic. So he collected basically a database of photographs. And then when he would draw and paint, he would sometimes even paste a photograph on this big wall as he was drawing. So this became very interesting to me. And it was something that permitted me to exceed my not liking the images. Later I came to really like them a lot, and especially this one.
Σε μια πρόσφατη διάλεξή σου για τις φωτογραφίες του Φάζαλ Σέικ από την Παλαιστίνη, είπες πως η φωτογραφία μαθαίνει την ιστορία να διαβάζει. Πώς μας μαθαίνουν τα φωτογραφικά του πορτρέτα του Φάζαλ Σέικ με τα ομιλούντα βλέμματα να διαβάζουμε εμείς την ιστορία? Πώς μας φέρνουν αντιμέτωπους με την καταλυτική παρουσία της απουσίας που εχμαλωτίζουν μέσα τους?
What I will do is I will close with some of the Palestine materials, but I'll say something about my long engagement with his work. I've been working on Fazl's photographic corpus for more than 20 years now. And I first encountered his work in this way. It was not long after 9/11, like weeks after 9/11. And there was a professor of photography at Princeton who, whenever he would teach a photography class, he would always show photographs of former students of his. And Fazl was one of his former students. So he showed a series of photographs of Fazl's in the class, and one of the students in the class, who was one of my students, brought me some of the photographs, which I'd never seen before. These were photographs of a project that Fazl did along the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan in the mid-1990s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And they were a series of photographs of just hands holding small photographs of dead fathers, sons, and brothers. And if you were living in New York, as I was, after 9/11, the one thing you would always see were narratives and images of everybody who died in the Twin Towers after the attack. You would never see images of singular deaths in Afghanistan. So I had these images of hands holding these little photographs of singular deaths in Afghanistan. And for about a year, I went around the world, Australia, Latin America, Europe, giving a talk called palm reading. And I would put the two images behind me and I would talk about them for an hour, and this would force the audience to look at singular deaths in Afghanistan. Fazl saw one of the recordings of one of these talks, and then he invited me to write on a different project, and then I continued writing on him. Now, what's interesting to me in that initial encounter with him is that you have this hand that is cut. You just a hand holding a photograph. So if you want to read a photograph, you have to do two things simultaneously. I'm going to tell you how to read a photograph. If you want to read a photograph, the first thing you have to do is contextualize the photograph. When did it happen? What's happening? Who's in it? Etc. But you at the same time have to pay attention not just to the contextualization of a photograph, but to the force of decontextualization that happens in every photograph. Every photograph rips something out of a context. So if you look at this photograph, on the one hand, it's a photograph that has sealed within it the history of the Soviet invasion, the history of the occupation of Afghanistan. It has a long history sealed inside it, and the violence against these. These are images that Fazl took traveling with the Northern Army during the Taliban ban against images. And so he was taking these images in secret at night under the light of a small lamp. And so they're clandestine images in some way. But because they're also severed and decontextualized, the hand is ripped from its body, it's also an allegory of photography. Because every photograph, like a hand, hands over something, hands over a memory, passes a memory down. So the hand becomes a figure for the process of transmission. So if you're thinking about these portraits, and these are portraits of portraits, because you have the little image, so they're photographs of photographs, they're memorials of memorials, you can begin to generate not just the history that is sealed in the image, but also a theory of photography, right? In relation to the absence that you're talking about, because again, these are images of people who have passed, people who are dead. They're memorials of people who are no longer here. And they're also asking us to remember the dead, right? To remember who's no longer here. And so this question of reading the images historically and training history to read comes up explicitly then in the Palestine talk, because there I do a reading of a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. It's a poem called The Humor of Eternity. And what he's talking about toward the end of that poem is the way in which people in graves in the desert, which are different than graves in cities, for him the graves in the desert are different, put little photographs on the graves to train history to read. That's his phrase. And what it is it's to train history to read, to understand that the past is never just past, that the past survives and becomes a lens of, just like I'm using the Afghanistan images to read 9/11. That's why it was called palm reading. These are photographs that are not just about the past. Memory is as much about the future as it is about the past. And so the way in which I'm reading these photographs being put on the graves in the desert is like Fazl putting these photographs in front of us in this book, in this project. And the training history to read, it's a strange thing. It's not training us to read history. It's training history how to read. So it's training history to read differently, right? It's not about resurrecting the past as it was. It's about understanding the way in which the past lives on in the present and influences the way we look at the present. So that I'm looking at this project in 2015 of Fazl in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and using it as a lens through which to read the genocide in Gaza, right? So that there's a way in which the history that he has sealed in those photographs is the history we need to know in order to understand what's happening today. Because what's happening today didn't fall from the sky. It wasn't born in a desert. There's a history to it. So training history to read on the basis of these photographs, I mean, in some sense, I'm saying his photographic corpus is itself a training manual on how to read, right? The photographs teach us how to read, and they're telling us, among other things, that photographs record, they document, they preserve, they seal within them an entire network of historical relations. This is actually very important because you look at a flat surface and you say, like, for example, we have a portrait of you, and somebody says, oh, that's Andreas. And I say, okay, that's Andreas, but really what you're looking at in that portrait of Andreas are all the faces that went into the making of Andreas, right? That face is an archive of an entire network of historical relations. So to train history to read is to get history to understand that whatever it's looking at is an archive and has to be read. And that archive also is not an archive only about the past, but it's an archive that helps facilitate a future to come.
Γιατί επέλεξες την επιστολική μορφή στο κείμενό σου για τις συγκλονιστικές φωτογραφίες της Σούζαν Μεϊζέλας? Μεταδίδει το κείμενο στον αναγνώστη μια μνήμη κυταρική. Τον κάνει συμμέτοχο σε μια ανάγνωση διακινδύνευσης, θα έλεγα. Κρατώ από αυτόν τον ανοιχτό στο χρόνο μεταξύ σας διάλογο τα παρακάτω λόγια που τις απευθύνεις και διαβάζω απευθείας από το κείμενό σου. Ενθαρρύνοντάς μας, λες στη Σούζαν Μεϊζέλας, να διαβάζουμε μορφές και σχήματα, να βλέπουμε γράμματα που από μόνα τους δεν λένε τίποτε, το πρώτο αυτό πείραμα μας δίνει τη δυνατότητα να δούμε μέσα από αυτές τις οπτικές ομοιοκαταληξίες σχέσεις μεταξύ διαφορετικών εποχών και τόπων που διαφορετικά δεν θα μπορούσαμε να φανταστούμε. Πράγματι, διαβάζοντας αυτά τα σχήματα συντακτικά το ένα σε σχέση με το άλλο, που σημαίνει όχι μόνο διαβάζοντάς τα και τα σχήματα και τις μορφές το ένα σε σχέση με το άλλο, αλλά και σε σχέση με ολόκληρο το δίκτυο ιστορικών σχέσεων που εμπεριέχουν, όπως μας έλεγες πριν, έχουμε τη δυνατότητα να αρχίσουμε να καταγράφουμε το θέατρο των ένσαρκων σημείων μέσα στο οποίο ζούμε, θρηνούμε και πεθαίνουμε.
This is another instance where maybe it helps for me to give the background of writing the letter and so on. I had actually given a lecture for the ICP in New York, the International Center for Photography in New York, in conjunction with I was the keynote for a conference in conjunction with an exhibition that was a retrospective of Susan's work. So I give a talk actually on Fazl, on his project on dispossessed widows in India. I give the talk, Susan's in the audience, she comes up to me, she says that it was a beautiful talk, the perfect person to write on this, we need to have breakfast. So I meet her for breakfast. During the breakfast she says, one day I want you to write on my work, but I want us to be friends first. And I found this extremely beautiful because I get asked to write on different people all the time, but nobody had ever said that to me. So we became friends. She's one of my closest friends. And so there was a moment in 2017 where she calls me and says, I now know what I want you to write. I have an exhibition coming up at the Capes in Barcelona. It'll move to the Jeu de Paume in Paris. I want you to be the one who pulls everything together. Okay. I get a call from the curator. He says, oh, Susan tells me you're the one who's going to pull it all together. You have 3,000 words. So 40 years of work, 3,000 words. I completely freak. I don't know how I'm going to do this. But I discover, as I'm thinking about what to do, the very first little book that Susan put together in 1974. Spiral-bound little book, 101, it's called Learn to See, 101 experiments on how to use photography to teach children how to see differently. So I think, oh, it's a manual on how to see. Oh wait, but all of her work is a manual on how to see. So I decide to take 5 of the exercises of this little book out and use those 5 exercises as a frame to read the entire corpus of Susan. I still don't know how I'm going to do it in 3,000 words, but this is what I decide to do. I start writing the essay. When I'm writing the essay in the beginning, one of my closest friends, Werner Hamacher, dies. His daughter calls me and says, before my dad died, he asked me to ask you to organize his memorial. So don't ever do a memorial. But I felt I needed to do it. So I tell Susan what's happening. She tells me she doesn't know how I can mourn and write at the same time, so that I should just take my time, they'll adjust, and so on. So I start writing, and I'm writing this essay. But the essay keeps growing and growing, because Susan's work is full of corpses and ruins and so on. So there's a way in which I can't let the essay go. I feel that if I let the essay go, I'm letting go of Werner. So as I'm writing the essay, at a certain point, the essay transforms into a letter to Susan. It's almost as if I needed to write a letter to a living friend. So this is how it became a letter. The passage you cite is from the first exercise that I borrow from the Learn to See book called alphabetography. Alphabetography is a little exercise where you ask children to look for letters of the alphabet in objects in the world. So for example, an O on the top of the glass. You look for letters in things in the world. So it's a way of thinking about the relationship between language and materiality and so on. So I read a lot of her photographs. I find letters in her photographs. I mean, so that her very famous, I'll just give a couple examples. She's a very famous image of just a torso on the Nicaraguan landscape of a rebel who had been killed by the government, by the regime, and left to rot, basically, his corpse. And so the vultures have eaten parts of the body. So basically you have just a torso. It's a very difficult image to look at. It has the image, and then it has like two legs. It looks like a Y. So at a certain point, there are other images where she has Ys in them. So I started looking for letters in her corpus and then put those different photographs in relation to one another. And this became a way for me to also think about how to read photographs. That when you're reading photographs, you have to also put them in relation to other photographs. Every photograph is serial. It belongs to a series of photographs. And so I could give lots of examples, but it's a way of, again, thinking that the reading of a photograph doesn't stay with just the photograph. There are many things in a photograph, many worlds in a photograph. So the alphabetography exercise, which I used to read parts of her corpus, was again a lever and a lens through which to find one strand through the work. And then the other exercises I used to do that too. But it was never meant to be a letter. They wanted 3,000 to 4,000 words. I submitted 23,000 words. They completely freaked out. They didn't have money for the translation. They didn't have space in the book. But because I had written it in sections and because they wanted me to cut, I just used the alphabetography section for the publication, for the catalog. But the full letter is in paper graveyards.
Αν τα έργα των ανθρώπων, κείμενα, φωτογραφίες, ζωγραφιές είναι πάντοτε η παρουσία μιας οριστικής απουσίας, όπως λες, το ανεξάλειπτο ίχνος της, αν είμαστε πάντοτε αντιμέτωποι με τα ερείπια της ιστορίας και τα χάρτινα κοιμητήριά τους, πώς αναδύεται για σένα, για τη δική σου θεώρηση το παρελθόν, πώς επιστρέφει ορμητικά με τα μετέωρα αιτήματά του έτοιμο να συναντηθεί με το επίμονο βλέμμα του δικού μας παρόντος, πώς τελικά διανοίγει τον ιστορικό και πολιτικό ορίζοντα.
I mean, I did say earlier that we live among ruins and loss. And I think that one of the things that we do, and one of the things that let's say, makes history what it is our engagement with something that is always about to vanish, right? I mean, that history names a process, among other things, of things that are always in the process of vanishing, transforming, changing, never the same from one moment to the next, right? So in some way, this is also something that happens with the photograph, right? You take a photograph of someone, no matter how fast the click is, no matter how fast the mechanism is, there's always a delay. Even if it's a millisecond, there's a delay. So there's never a match between what's before you and the picture. That discrepancy is something that we can talk about in another context, but I think that in some way what you have is that we're always living, existing in relation to ruins, things that are mortal, things that are vanishing, and that this becomes the context within which we have to act politically. Right, so that if you think that you're acting within something that is always changing, this becomes a much more difficult calculation. One of the things that I sometimes ask my students to imagine is what a politics would look like if it was based on the model of tiers. And they look at me like I'm some kind of crazo, like what am I asking? But if you think of how we act politically, you look at a situation, you evaluate it, and on the basis of the evaluation, you decide what to do. So acting politically is generally based on a model of vision. When you have tears in your eyes, you can't see things clearly, right? So a theory of politics based on the model of tears is a theory of politics that begins in the presupposition that you always act without seeing things clearly. You always act with tears in your eyes. And when you're witnessing someone crying, what you're witnessing is somebody melting. So that you have to reconceptualize the political subject as a subject that is always fluid, that is altering, that is never the same from one moment to the next. Again, someone who is present but vanishing, changing, transforming. So I think that for me, this question of the past and how it emerges, the past, as I said before, is never just past. Faulkner once says the past is never dead. I used, as I said before, the Pakistan, Afghanistan images to read not just the present, but also the future. So that we exist in relation to the past and we read in relation to the past. We're mediated in some way. That past determines what we're capable of seeing. And at the same time, it's a constraint, but we can never be fully determined by that past, right? So that you produce something singular, historically, politically, by passing through what you inherit, but passing through it by at the same time altering it and transforming it, right? Nothing is created or done in a vacuum. So that you always have to pass through what you inherit, right? And so a lot of the readings of the images that I do in the book, a lot of the sections in the book are, let's say, motivated by this conviction. There is a link between the past and the present and the future. And that if these were not connected and entangled with one another, there would be no chance for change. It's precisely because the past, the present, and the future are entangled at every moment that things unfold in ways that are different than just the past. Because that's, I mean, if you think that one of the things that motivates us is to change the relations in which we live, that can only happen, as I say, by passing through what you inherit, but you pass through it and alter it and change it and transform it in order to produce something that won't simply be a repetition of the past. So the past is always there. It's always mediating us, but it's our task not to be fully determined by it.
Ο Μανώλης Αθανασάκης είναι ένας άνθρωπος που εκτιμάς πολύ και του εμπιστεύεσαι τη μετάφραση των κειμένων σου. Στις λέξεις «φωτός», το πρώτο βιβλίο σου που μεταφράστηκε εξαιρετικά στα ελληνικά, επίσης από τον Μανώλη, και κυκλοφόρησε από τις εκδόσεις Νήσος, έγραφες: «Το πρωτότυπο δίνει στο μεταφραστή του την άδεια να διαπράξει απιστία. Του παρέχει την ελευθερία να επινοήσει μια σχέση με μια γλώσσα που δεν έχει ως τώρα εμφανιστεί, ακόμα και να επινοήσει αυτή τη γλώσσα». Και ο Μανώλης, ο Αθανασάκης, στο σημείωμά του στα Χαρτιά κοιμητήρια, που επίσης μεταφράζει, γράφει ότι ένα βιβλίο συνεχίζει εσαΐ να διαμορφώνεται με όσα του επιφυλάσσει το μέλλον και ότι οι μεταφράσεις του σε άλλες γλώσσες αποτελούν εσωτερικά στοιχεία αυτής της διαδικασίας. Θέλεις να μας πεις περισσότερα για αυτή την αναπόδραστη απιστία της μετάφρασης?
Let's say what I have said in the past about the infidelity of translation comes from a reading of Benjamin's Task of the Translator essay, which he writes as a preface to his translation of Baudelaire's Parisian tableaux, right? So in there, what he says is that what you experience in the activity of translation is actually the foreignness of all languages, including yours, right? So that there's a way in which for him, translation as an activity is not about conveying the meaning of something, but rather conveying the impossibility almost of translating, right? So that for him, the most faithful translations, the translations that are most faithful to the activity and process of translations are the most unfaithful ones, because they're the ones that let us know that a translation can never convey something from the original language. And in fact, it's not supposed to. For him, the best translations are the absolutely most violent translations. So he's very interested, for example, in Hölderlin's translations of Sophocles' Antigone. And he appreciates Hölderlin's translations because of their violence. Because in that violence, they mark the discrepancy between a translation and the original. And they also, in some way, mark the necessity of a translation to reinvent the original, right? It's not there to produce an exact replica of the original, but actually to give it another life, to give it an afterlife, to reinvent it in some way. So that when a book passes into another language, it doesn't pass as what it was, it's altered. And this is something that is actually very photographic, because what I've said before, that no matter how fast the camera is, there's always a discrepancy. And that discrepancy between the photograph and what was photographed has its analog in the discrepancy between an original and a translation. Because for Benjamin, that original is itself already the result of a series of translations. So that for Benjamin, the activity of translation is not an activity about fidelity to an original. It's a relation, or let's say a faithfulness to the wildness of language, right? The wildness and the mobility of language, the monstrosity of language, he calls it. So that he's the best translation is the one that stays faithful to that monstrosity, to the monstrosity of language, to the incapacity of language to convey a single, fixed, determinate meaning. And so what I was thinking, there's a very beautiful Argentinian novel called El Pasado, The Past, and it's about a translator. And he's getting separated from his lover, and so he goes through a series of affairs. And so his infidelity becomes mapped onto the infidelity of his translations. It's a very nice way to think about it. But I talk because I'm thinking about Benjamin's essay, which is called The Task of the Translator. If I remember right, the intro I wrote for the translation of Words of Light was called The Task of Infidelity, which is to say it's a task, it's a labor, it's what the translator all has to do. So that one of the beautiful things about the fact that this book is being translated is not just that it has another life, but it's absolutely reinvented. And this for me is very beautiful.
Τον ανέφερες και πριν, όταν μας περιέγραφες πώς πρωτοσυνάντησες τη Σούζαν. Γι' αυτό θα ήθελα να σε ρωτήσω για την αφιέρωση στην αρχή του βιβλίου. Αφιερώνεις το βιβλίο σου στη μνήμη του Βέρνερ Χαμάκερ. Είναι ελάχιστα γνωστό στη χώρα μας. Τι σε συνδέει μαζί του, με τη σκέψη του και με το έργο του? Μια εκλεκτική συγγένεια, η μνήμη μιας πνευματικής οφειλής και φιλίας?
I first met Werner when I was a graduate student at the University of California at Irvine. He had come to give a lecture, and he gave a lecture on Nietzsche's Übermensch, which is often translated as overman, superman, whatever. He translated it as the outman. And I loved it. I mean, I just thought, what a daring translation. I mean, the man that's out, that never fits, so it's that exceeds any kind of conceptualization, definition, etc. That was my first introduction to him. I started reading him. Werner was one of the great close readers. Hegel, Marx, Benjamin, Celan. He was an extraordinary reader of texts. So one of the things that I learned from him was patience, the necessity of reading slowly, the necessity of paying attention to the mobility of language, the obligation to understand that language is an archive, that language has sealed within it an entire network of historical relations, so that if you want to read a sentence, you have to put a lot of sentences alongside that sentence. The meaning of a sentence doesn't inhere in the sentence, but in fact has to be read syntactically in relation to other sentences, not all of them belonging to the book that you're reading, because a lot of them, a sentence can bear within it references to other books and so on. So there was a way in which this wish on my part to read historically had an influence from Werner. This sense, his sort of obsession with excavating language and the mobility of language. I was asked at one point to contribute to a Festschrift, to a collection of essays on him, or for him, when he turned 60. And I returned to Emerson's essay, Friendship, and wrote an essay on the laws of friendship. And the thing about that essay, which is so beautiful, I think, is that it begins with a little parable. And in this parable, a commended stranger is coming to a house. And it's not the people in the house, but the house itself is trembling in anticipation of the stranger's arrival. The people in the house are getting their best clothes on, they're cooking food, they're cleaning the house, they're getting ready for his arrival. He arrives, and as soon as he opens his mouth, the people in the house say, he can be a friend no more. Because as soon as he opens his mouth, they register his prejudices, his biases, and so that he can be a friend no more. What's beautiful about the little parable is that it immediately exposes the biases and prejudices of the people in the house. And Emerson says, the stranger stands for all of humanity. So the stranger, we remain strange to each other and to ourselves. So this is an essay on friendship that is about the distance and separation and interval on the basis of which we establish friendships, which is to say, there's always a relation, but there always has to be a kind of distance. Aside from the fact that Werner was very tall, so there was always this distance between us that way. The relation, we had different languages, we had different, so the relation was established across these differences. And one of the beautiful things about the essay on friendship is that what the virtue of friendship is that it's the not mine that is mine. That the other always exceeds your understanding. And toward the end of the essay, he says, we will have met as if we never met, and we will part as if we never parted. So we will have met as if we never met because you can never fully know the other, but you will part as if you never parted because from the very first moment you're moved by someone, touched by someone, become friends with someone, then you carry a trace of them in you forever. So they part without parting in some way. And so this essay came back to me as I was writing the letter to Susan and thinking about my long history. I knew Werner for almost over 30 years. And the way in which, even as I was writing the letter, his language was in my head. So it was one of the things that was mediating my own engagement with these corpses and ruins and so on. This is a little detail, a little confession. I wrote a letter, actually, I think it was to Paula, actually, at one point, after the death of Werner. I signed it Werner. So this was the confirmation of not just the identification, but also the dissolving of my identity that resulted from the death of my close friend. But he was one of he was a translator of Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy. He studied with Peter Zondi. He knew Adorno. So he comes from this background that was very important to me. And he, I think, still stands as one of the great readers of German philosophy.
Στο πρόλογο σου χαρακτηρίζεις το βιβλίο σου σαν μια ανθολογία των σκέψεών σου για τη φωτογραφία τα τελευταία 20 χρόνια και φτιάχνεις μια πάρα πολύ ωραία αναλογία ανάμεσα στα άνθη, τα κείμενα και τις εικόνες και τελικά την ίδια τη ζωή που μετασχηματίζονται διαρκώς μέσα στον χρόνο και δεν παραμένουν ποτέ ταυτόσιμα με τον εαυτό τους. Αυτή σου αναφορά μου έφερε στο μυαλό την προτροπή του Βολτέρου που αγάπησε και η Ρόζα Λούξεμπουργκ, πάντοτε να καλλιεργούμε τον κήπο μας. Ο δικός σου κήπος είναι και αυτός φτιαγμένος από λέξεις και εικόνες, από ιστορία και απουσία. Η καλλιέργειά του αποτελεί μια πράξη εξεγερσιακής μελαγχολίας, θα έλεγα, πράξη βαθύτατα πολιτική που μας διδάσκει να διαβάζουμε και να βλέπουμε τις εικόνες αλλιώς.
I mean, it's a very beautiful question. I mean, it taps into the lyricism of the writing of the book, right? I mean, I wanted the book to be beautiful. I mean, in the language. So I spend a lot of time, I write at the level of sentences in the way that Emerson does, in the way that Benjamin does. And in some way, I feel very lucky that I fell in love with Emerson and Benjamin, because if you write about Emerson and Benjamin in academic language, you're experienced as a fool. So you have to become a better writer to write about them. So there was some way in which, again, I feel lucky I fell in love with them because I had to become a better writer in order to be able to write about them. And one of the ways in which I think you respond to writers who are lyrical, poetic, and performative is you create your own performance. So this figure of texts and flowers, texts and images as flowers, comes not only from the Greek anthologia, which is a collection of flowers, but also from a passage in Didi Uberman's The Eyes of History, right? And it's the epigraph to the book, so I'll just read it. It's very short. It says, I often feel when facing an image as though I'm in front of some unknown flower at an unknown stage of its transformation, right? And this is an extremely beautiful passage, and it what I love about it is not just the identification it makes between images and flowers, but on its insistence on our incapacity to know what an image is, and the way in which an image, maybe what makes an image is the fact that it's always transforming, always becoming something else, right? And so I take that as a kind of kernel or axiom for the book as I move through these things, because as I said in the very beginning, one of the things that organizes the readings is this sense that maybe we don't yet know what an image is. Like in this moment where we're surrounded by images and everybody thinks, the youth especially have a particular relation to images, they can't read an image. So I think it's again, this insistence on, if images can be like flowers or flowers can be like images, then maybe we don't know what an image is. Maybe we don't even know what a flower is, right? So I begin with this, and I like that you evoke not just the Voltaire, but also Rosa Luxemburg's liking of the Voltaire, because it also shows again that language and photography and art always begin elsewhere. They're always mediated, right? So when Rosa is thinking about Voltaire, one of the things you can say about Rosa is she was an amazing reader, right? She was always reading. And so that you can make the case that her political activism is inseparable from a labor of reading, right? She's reading Marx. Marx was also a great reader. So that you can talk about the role and place of reading within these political figures, right? The centrality of the practice of reading. As you probably know, Rosa was also somebody who collected flowers, right? And there are these very beautiful pressed flowers, the collections and the classifications, and she did a lot of this when she was in prison. So there's a way in which she cultivates her garden, and that garden is, the things she's producing, the book she's writing, so all these things she's doing, even within the walls of the prison. There's a way in which that activity of making, that activity of cultivating, allows her to exceed those constraints, right? And actually, one of the things that the book is very much about, I think, is the importance of the imagination, right? If the task is to change the relations which we live, you can't change those relations unless you can imagine something different. And so the performance of the readings in these things is to actually give a model of how one can begin to imagine things on the basis of what one inherits, right? And whether it's Luxembourg reading Voltaire, or me reading Luxembourg, or me reading Benjamin, all of these texts become comrades on the shelf, which can be used as resources for doing political work in the present. So that as you move through the volume, you begin with these lyrical, theoretical, whatever passages, but then they become the scaffolding for the later essays that are more directly political. And it's a way of demonstrating that this activity of thinking, this activity of reflection and meditation is inseparable from actively doing politics, right? And if you think of all the people that we think of as political figures, from Marx to Benjamin to Luxembourg, to etc., they are all readers. They're all reading, and they all are models on how to read historically in moments of danger. And so that I feel lucky, grateful that I have these comrades on the shelf. I feel lucky that I fell in love with thinking and reading at a very young age, because I think that especially in this particular moment, it's amazing to me how much sustenance and strength we get from reading. So yes, in some way this was me cultivating a garden, was me producing, and I even say that these essays, I put them together to see in what way they can blossom. And they blossom not only in the readings that people offer of them, which take them in directions that I couldn't have anticipated, but they also happen in relation to this translation, for example, which is another way of having it grow and blossom in this context. So, thank you.
Σε ευχαριστούμε εμείς, Εντουάρντο,
Thank you.
για αυτόν τον ολάνθιστο κήπο, τα χαρτιά κοιμητήριά σου. Σε ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.
Thank you.
Σε ευχαριστώ πολύ που μου έδωσες τη δυνατότητα να συνομιλήσουμε σήμερα μαζί. Πρέπει να ευχαριστήσουμε τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης για τη φιλοξενία και την υπέροχη έκδοση και το Μανώλη Αθανασάκη για την εξαιρετική μετάφραση. Ελπίζουμε το βιβλίο να είναι καλοτάξιδο και στη δική μας γλώσσα. Να είσαι καλά, Εντουάρντο.
Thank you. Thank you.